In Part 1, we traced the evolution of the law of war from the rise of the early empires through the invention of the modern nation-state. Differences between nations is a regular source of conflict, which sometimes leads to war. In this Part 2, we shift our attention from conflict between nations to conflict between groups within a nation. Conflict is hardly limited to disputes between sovereign nations. Many international conflicts have their roots in disputes inside a legal state. In fact, some so-called domestic conflicts highlight the arbitrariness of some national boundaries, and thus the arbitrariness of related distinctions between domestic and international disputes. But the definitions and distinctions are important, as there are real differences when it comes to the application of law. One of the primary obligations of the government of a sovereign nation is to secure the stability and order of its society. As we investigated in several Living Law Nations episodes, exercising control over a defined population and territory is one of the prerequisites for legal recognition as a state. Exactly how a state does this is another key issue, as is the legality of the means employed. When the exercise of freedoms of expression, assembly, and protest are perceived to threaten the security of a state, a government may feel obliged to act. In the Living Law Nation series, we cover a number of examples where political groups use national security as a means of acquiring and solidifying power. One of the most notorious examples of this was the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany.
In the background is the Reichstag, or German Parliament. And in the evening from February 27th into the 28th, 1933, a fire broke out here. Blame was laid at the feet of the communists. And within 24 hours, special laws were introduced in the name of national security. And this was a key event in the Nazis taking control of power.
Some believe the Nazis themselves had been behind the fire. Either way, it provided an opportunity for a clampdown, as Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to trigger emergency powers under the Weimar Constitution. The Reichstag fire decree was an example of martial law and permitted the government to restrict freedoms of expression and the press, as well as to curtail constitutional rights of privacy and protest. The Nazis used the new powers to increase intimidation tactics around elections, and by March had captured 44% of the vote. This allowed them to form a majority coalition and pass the Ermächtigungsgesetz, or Enabling Act. The Enabling Act altered the constitutional order in that the head of the cabinet, or executive, had virtually unlimited legislative powers. Adolf Hitler, as Chancellor, could now pass laws without the need for approval by the Reichstag. Exercising these new powers allowed Hitler and the Nazis to ban trade unions and outlaw political parties. Under the veneer of this newfound legality, the Nazis began to round up political opponents, especially communists and those on the left. In July of that year, Hindenburg died, thus eliminating this potential check on Nazi power. Within less than a year, Germany had transformed from a relatively liberal constitutional political order to what was essentially a one-party dictatorship. Most people are familiar with the physical division of the German people which resulted from the Second World War. Germany became ground zero for the Cold War which arose between the two superpowers who, until late 1945, had been united against a common enemy. Germany also became the location where many feared that a Third World War would begin. Berlin became a divided city with 4 separate zones allocated to the 4 main victorious Allied powers. It also became a center of intrigue and espionage. These days, the physical legacies of that Cold War are popular tourist attractions for visitors to Berlin. In that kind of setting, it's difficult to appreciate just how precarious the situation often was, especially in a period with nuclear weapons. To gain such an appreciation, we can look at another division with its roots in the Cold War, one which continues to this day.
All the blue buildings belong to the United Nations Command, or UNC, while all the gray buildings belong to the KPA or North Korea. Now if I can direct your attention to your far right, you're going to see a tall blue building. That is the Joint Duty Office, or JDO building. JDO is a U.S. Army officer who is the official representative for the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission and conducts all official talks between North and South Korea. Now directly across from the JDO building on top of the hill, you're going to see a 2-story tall great guard post. That is KPA guard post number 2, and it is monitoring us at this time, so once again, no pointing, waving, gesturing, or anything like that towards North Korea. What was that, sir?
How long ago was this?
It was in the 90s, I believe, sir. I do not know the exact date.
Now it's time to leave this place where the few official exchanges with North Korea take place and head to a looking outpost further along the DMZ.
Be surrounded on 3 sides by communist North Korea. To give you a better idea of that, I will explain that now. Now, if you look to the right, down about 50 meters out, you're going to see some of those white stakes that represent the military demarcation line. If you follow those stakes out, they actually fall out to the tree line where it makes an abrupt left. At that point, the MDL does the same thing, making a 90-degree angle. Following all the way down, bisecting the Sashon River, and running all the way down to the Han Estuary on the west. A little bit more simple terms, North Korea, North Korea, and North Korea. All sides of us right now.
The Cold War created all kinds of crucibles for experimenting with national security. Most countries on both sides of the Cold War touted the basic human rights enjoyed by their citizens, anchoring such rights in their constitutions. But the ability of individuals to exercise those rights was often limited by the application of national security laws. One common method of limiting the exercise of human rights was to have very general legal provisions related to national security. There were some ethnic Latvians who continued to push for the proper place of Latvian within the Soviet framework. This led to a type of gradual national awakening, but such persons always ran the risk of being deemed counter-revolutionaries according to Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code. In his novel The Gulag Archipelago, Soviet writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn described Article 58 as follows.
One can find more epithets in praise of this article than Turgenev once assembled to praise the Russian language, or Nekrasov to praise Mother Russia. Great, powerful, abundant, highly ramified, multiform, wide-sweeping 58. which summed up the world not so much through the exact terms of its sections as in their extended dialectical interpretation. Who among us has not experienced its all-encompassing embrace? In all truth, there is no step, thought, action, or lack of action under the heavens which could not be punished by the heavy hand of Article 58.
Acquiring detailed knowledge about the citizens of a society and their activities also facilitates the maintenance of control. Some political regimes stretch or even break their own constitutions in order to combat perceived threats to their authority.
Now, how was it that such a relatively small portion of society managed to maintain such a strong grip on the millions of Romanians throughout those decades? Well, for one thing, they knew everything about everybody.
Now, to be honest, I'm a little nervous about covering this next topic, so we've hopped in a taxi and we'll cover it on the go. After all, you never know who might still be listening. The Securitate apparatus had an entire vocabulary describing who had exactly what role in seeking information on Romanian citizens. Similarly, the fruits of all these efforts had a well-defined structure and nomenclature, with DUI taking on a whole new meaning. Informers had different motives for assisting the Securitate. Some did it for money or other reward, others were blackmailed, and still others did it voluntarily, seeing it as their civic duty. The motivation of an individual was noted in their file. Informers were only kept active as long as they were deemed useful to the secret police. Interestingly, upon becoming a member of the Romanian Communist Party, a citizen could have their personal file destroyed. After years and years of all this surveillance activity, the Romanian state was left with a mountain of information about its citizens. The use of national security laws to control the citizenry was hardly a monopoly of the communist or socialist countries. Right-leaning governments and dictatorships used similar tactics and tools. In an attempt to address the discontent in Portuguese society, the regime clamped down on political activity. The state police became widely feared, and surveillance became the order of the day. With the Cold War raging across the globe, the police sometimes resorted to measures which would be considered contrary to human rights under modern Portuguese law.
Era mais sofisticado no mercado internacional. Milhares e milhares de fichas continham muito da história do antifascismo português. Lisboa, o Rua António Maria Cardoso. Este foi o edifício sede da Polícia Política até ao 25 de abril. No terceiro andar deste edifício, onde ficavam as salas de interrogatório, a lei, segundo diziam os próprios espíritos, não entrava.
The law may not have entered this building, but living law will. Sometimes surveillance and suppression of dissent are not enough to provide as much stability or security as a ruling government might wish. A classic tool in dealing with violent uprisings is the imposition of martial law. The scope and duration of what are meant to be extraordinary and temporary measures speak volumes about the stability of a nation's system of rule.
Just another tranquil morning here in Bangkok, but that hasn't been the case recently. In fact, believe it or not, the country has been living under martial law for almost a year leading up to our visit. And that will bring us to our next topic, law and democracy in Thailand.
Thailand has experienced periodic military coups, the first coming within a year of the introduction of the first constitution. Subsequent coups have varied both in their duration and in the level of heavy-handedness applied by the military regime against the civilian population. Some of the most restrictive regimes were impacted, if not triggered, by external geopolitical events. Coups were often accompanied by revisions of the Constitution, such as in 1957, when an express provision for military rule over the parliamentary system was added. During the 1970s, the Vietnam War and fear of the encroachment of communism heavily influenced Thai politics. During such periods of political tension, there are heightened risks of laws such as lèse-majesté being abused for political purposes to quell dissent.
On October 14th, 1973, a crowd of thousands of students and faculty members assembled here on the football grounds to protest the dictatorial regime. The event turned out to be a milestone on Thailand's road to further democracy.
The uprising of October 1973 ended with 77 people being killed and almost 1,000 wounded. The protesters appealed to the king for assistance, and he responded by revoking the military's authority and restoring civilian rule.
Yup, just another peaceful morning here in Bangkok. Makes you wonder why they need martial law at all. And actually, there's an article in this morning's Bangkok Post on that very topic. Panitan puts case for keeping martial law. A government advisor has defended the continuation of martial law after a group of lawyers released a damning report that exposed violations of human rights and international obligations under martial law. Panitan Watanayagorn, a political science expert and advisor to the Ministry of Defense, said the political situation is not yet stable enough to lift martial law despite human rights concerns. Under a country with martial law, you'd expect certain pressure on human rights just to keep peace, order, and civility, he said. Of course, the military realizes that in the end, in principle, martial law is not good for Thailand because it's a strong pill. If you take a strong medicine too long, it may destroy your internal organs.
And so, a younger generation, in search of a bright and stable future, make offerings as Thai people have done throughout the ages. As they wait for that future to unfold, they can only hope that the internal organs of the state are in a process of regeneration and rebirth, and not decay. All these examples highlight the paramount importance which the issue of national security has. individual leaders' views on how to maintain security can vary widely and run to extremes. We will end this episode with some scenes from a nation which experienced such a leader and such a phase. Albania's program of bunkerizimi, or bunkerization, ran from 1967 through 1983. The government had more than 170,000 bunkers built across the country. That is equivalent to approximately 6 per square kilometer or 15 per square mile of Albanian territory. The program was driven by Hoxha's and the party's fear of invasion. All Albanian citizens were expected to defend the country in case of attack. More than a quarter of the population had either active military status or was in the reserves. The bunkerization program was a huge drain on the country's resources, making Albania one of the poorest nations in Europe. The program continued until Hoxha's death in 1985. Nowadays, the bunkers are popular tourist attractions and serve as a reminder of this strange phase in Albania's modern history. I suppose, like diplomacy, that's one way to deal with the risk of conflict.